It takes just a second for the air conditioning to kick off. And then it won't be so cold for folks in here anymore. So I want to welcome all of you to tonight's program, Tattooing Finds You, How Tattooists Navigate Their World. And just so you know, we are live streaming this on our YouTube page so people can tune in at home. So it's all being recorded. Keep it clean. Don't say anything that would make your mom upset. It's on the internet. My name is Candace Summers. I'm the Director of Community Education here at the McLean County Museum of History. And I am very pleased to welcome Dr. David Lane, who is our speaker tonight. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice Sciences at Illinois State University, and he holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Delaware. And you've been studying this for a long time, right? At least a decade. Excellent. So I'm really looking forward to this program. I've been looking forward to it ever since we learned about your new book that came out last year, was it? 2021, so that was last year. Feels like a lifetime ago. If you haven't had a chance, before you leave tonight, stop by on the first floor off the rotunda to check out a really cool display from Chad Ramsey at Illinois Tattoo Company. He brought in some of his collection of tattoo equipment and ephemera and designs. So there's a couple table cases down there that you can check out as well. But enough from me. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. David Lane.
All right, thanks for the introduction, Candace. Before we get started, I think there's a couple things to say. Number one, we have to thank not only Candace, but everybody here at the McLean County Museum of History. This is a cultural event. One of the things that I hope becomes evident throughout this talk is that culture doesn't exist because one individual put effort into it. It takes the effort of a lot of people who are embedded in networks. This wasn't just Candace who put this on. There were a number of people behind the scenes here at the museum that worked hard to do this. And to some extent, if we really want to think about this in a broader sense, at some point somebody built this building, and we wouldn't be here doing this in this space if all these other people weren't involved at some point. And some of them are no longer with us, and so let's just recognize that cultural events actually take a lot of us. And I guess I'm forgetting one group though. You all in the audience, we wouldn't have this event if you all weren't here. So maybe thank yourselves for being here too. With that said, I've got to thank somebody else. And again, Chad Ramsey at Illinois Tattoo Company. If you see any images with this blue star on it, they are images from his private collections of tattoo things that he has collected over a number of years in his career. I bugged him for a number of days, and he let me come into his shop and take photos of things to put into this presentation. The reason for this was that I was trying to figure out a way to connect our local community of tattooers, our local art community, to research that I had done in a land that's kind of far away. Everybody I interviewed for my book, I interviewed in Baltimore, Maryland. And so how do we connect the kinds of things that they experienced to our local art community? And while I interviewed people in Baltimore, they have very similar experiences to the people that tattoo here. And maybe I should just skip ahead in this and say, tattooing's been in this community for a long time. There's a black and white photo behind me. That's the Jewett family. That was taken by somebody at the Pantograph in 1937. And they were tattooing themselves in their apartment in the East 200 block of Front Street. Isn't that about 2 blocks that way? So we know tattooing's been here for a while. And in my hassling of Chad to get these photographs, I ended up taking a picture of this stencil up here. And I was thinking about telling a story about how tattooers used to use these stencils, and it's a kind of obsolete part of the history, but they're important collectible objects of producing tattoo culture. And when I started to put this PowerPoint together, I noticed something in the bottom corner, something that I originally intended to crop out of this photo. There's a little tag, and it's a little sticker, and it says Zeiss Studio on it. Zeiss Studio might not mean anything to most people, but if you're involved in tattooing, it's Milton Zeiss. Milton Zeiss ran a supply company that sold tattoo supplies to tattooers from, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, he sold tattoo supplies to people all around the US and the world, right in Rockford, Illinois. I thought, how do I draw this connection to Baltimore? And then I realized something. In Milton Zeiss's collection, he has tattoo machines from a guy named Tattoo Charlie. Tattoo Charlie, his name was Charlie Geiser. He worked on the Strip in Baltimore for about 40 years, from 1941 until 1980 when he died. So there's that connection. But then something really amazing happened. Milton Zeiss, in the early 1950s, and this is these little orange packets here, he started a correspondence course to teach people how to tattoo. And you would send him $125 and he would mail you a lesson. And then you would mail it back and he'd give you feedback. And there were 20 lessons. This correspondence course was approved by none other than the acting governor of Illinois at that time period, Adlai Stevenson, who rests not far from here. So I think there are these connections, and it was interesting putting this together that I tried to tease this out. Most of my work, most of my work is in Baltimore, and really tattooing has been in this community and something that is part of Illinois. It's not just something that has existed on the coast. It has been part of the central part of the country for a long period of time. Oop, wrong way. I'm going to give the brief version of the theory here. I titled this talk, Tattooing Finds You. And it actually comes from a much longer quote from one of the people I interviewed. She goes by the pseudonym Brenda. And in this quote, I think she highlights the main theme. And the main theme is that we're not doing things as isolated individuals. We're embedded in communities. So when she's saying tattooing finds you, it's not that some force out of her control found her. She was embedded in networks with other people. And as a result of those networks, she was able to learn how to tattoo and establish a career in this job. In fact, Brenda had an amazing transition to tattooing. She actually had a master's degree in fine art and was doing installation art. Ultimately, she ended up climbing up some scaffolding to put something together, fell off, she hurt her knee, and never went back to installation art again. But as she gravitated towards tattooing, she found a way to practice her interest in art and then make a little bit of money off of it and have an actual career doing something. So much of my work is inspired by this notion of what we call an art world. And Art Worlds is a book by Howard Becker. He basically argues what I've been saying all along: we're not isolated individuals. And he says there's pretty much four main characteristics in any art world. One, there's a hierarchy, right? People are ranked above people, and they specialize in different kinds of labor that they need to carry out. Fairly simple concept. He says that art worlds also have rules defining who is an artist and who isn't. And if we think about some kinds of art worlds like movies, certainly some people get far more credit than others, but at the end of the day, wasn't there somebody needed that doesn't get a lot of credit that's absolutely necessary to make that movie? And I'm thinking about the person that reloads the film and the camera, or that fixes those cameras while they're on set. It's an absolutely necessary role, and if somebody doesn't fulfill that task, not a lot of movies are going to get made. But that person doesn't necessarily receive the same credit as, say, a director or one of the actors. Another characteristic of art worlds is that there's a lot of cooperation. Generally, people in art worlds are linked to other people from that same world, and they need each other. If we're thinking about tattooing, there's a lot of interdependence. I mean, it's easy to think that someone in tattooing does this job in isolation in some dark, cavernous tattoo shop somewhere, and they don't need to rely on others. But logically, that presents us with a little bit of a problem. Because if somebody were to do all the things that they needed to tattoo, they wouldn't have a lot of time to actually get the tattooing done. Where would they find something like a tattoo machine? Or would they spend days making this and not actually making money tattooing? So in a sense, even tattooists are dependent upon others within that world who might specialize in building something like a machine. where would they find designs from? This is a Mr. Flash design. Mike Malone, he's a well-known tattooer. It came from Chad's collection. He would mail these out to people, and you could buy tattoo designs from him. He actually would mail them out from Sailor Jerry's old shop. We'll get into that a little bit later. Up in this upper corner here, this is Cindy Ray. But this is also Cindy Ray. And she never actually intended to be tattooed. She actually was a model, and she started doing some photography work, and the photographer paid for her tattoos, and then she became this heavily tattooed person and then gravitated towards a career in tattooing. So I guess this interdependence theme, we're all necessary, we come from these communities, and that's how work gets produced, distributed, and then consumed by others. And I should mention there are also these rules of the game. Generally, people agree upon who should do what, how much of it, when they should do it. They're negotiable. They're not written down in say, the bureaucratic writings of like a formal organization, but there are general agreements of how to do things. So, this tattoo world. At the top of it are characters like that person in the center photo. That's Horiyoshi III, probably for the last 2 decades, if not 3. He's been known as one of the best tattooers in the world. He produces these full body suits that are elaborate, highly sought after things that tattoo consumers want. And there's a lot of information about people like Horiyoshi III out there. People publish books on them. He's the kind of character that produces his own art and then it becomes collectible art books. But most tattooers are never going to be like Horiyoshi. I mean, he's riding the top of some of the best training, some of the best access to networks, some of the best access to materials. He's got things going for him in terms of opportunities that many others won't have. So the story in this book is less about some of these major characters and more about the everyday actors that are involved in tattooing. And when I start to think about this, I've designed a little model to lay out how people are sort of positioned in this world. It's what I call the social world of tattooing. Obviously, at the top of this model are these legends and masters. This is where Horiyoshi falls. I would say Mike Malone, who I just mentioned that little flash thing from, he's probably in the legends and masters. Sailor Jerry is there, Ed Hardy is there, Jamie Summers is there. These are major tattoo figures in the history of the world. Major people. But most tattooers are never going to be in that category. They fall into this category of either being a craftsman or an artist. And these are intentionally designed triangles. Obviously, at the top of the triangle, there are fewer people, and it's a hierarchy within that triangle. As you move up, you get greater rewards. But there's a particular reason why I've divided this into artists and craftsmen. Each of them have a different set of sort of orientations toward their work, as well as rewards that they're seeking out. And we'll get into that in a little bit. I should mention, though, that there's this little blue triangle in the middle. There's a bit of overlap between the artists and craftsmen. It's not like they're completely mutually exclusive all the time. And in fact, many of those who become successful in the artist hierarchy were quite dependent upon craftsmen, especially early on in their careers, to learn how to tattoo. And even the artists that are kind of at the top of that hierarchy, they're still dependent on the craftsmen. Otherwise, they might not get the kinds of things that they need to produce tattoos. Quality machines, quality pigments, things that the craftsmen are focusing their time and energy on. Hence, there's this interdependence and hence there's this interdependence on each other as a kind of necessity to carry out this labor. And at the bottom, I have this interesting category of shoplists and scratchers, and I came across a few of these characters in my work. They're a kind of necessary evil. I don't think anyone admits to falling into this category, but it's a kind of label that's created in order to police the boundaries of legitimate tattooing. And it's a quite important label because if you talk to tattooists, they'll tell you a lot of characteristics make up a scratcher, but there's one thing at the center of every definition. The scratcher is a really, really bad person. So, back to this little hierarchy. I'm out of frame. Back to this little hierarchy here. We've got Horiyoshi at work. There are some characteristics that set these legends and masters apart from other tattooers. These top two photos here are Horiyoshi III at work. Maybe I should get into a little bit of the exceptional training. See, he wasn't born with the name Horiyoshi. His name was actually Nakano. And if you know a little bit about Japanese art traditions, he actually took on the name of his master, who trained him under a particular Japanese art school. And he's the third because the master was the first Horiyoshi. The second was somebody else, and then he became Horiyoshi III. Now, Horiyoshi IV is actually his blood-related son, but he had no blood relationship to his master. What's important about a story like that is that he's really carrying on an artistic tradition from the sort of classical notion of a Japanese art house. Right? The family name gets passed on as, this is the Horiyoshi tradition. Now, that's not the only one in Japan. There's the Horihido family, and there's a few more. But these are names that get passed on because people have apprenticed and learned how to do this craft a particular way, and then it becomes an honorific symbol of who you are. But that kind of training is not what most people receive in tattooing. And that's exceptional training, where you might apprentice to learn how to do this for multiple years before you're even allowed to tattoo somebody. So while Horiyoshi might have exceptional skills and talents, he had a kind of apprenticeship that most people aren't going to have access to. And that changes his career trajectory. I mean, imagine if you had access to certain kinds of people in your networks early on in your careers. Might that change the kind of job you have? And that's exactly what happens to Horiyoshi. I'm not discrediting his talent. That's not what I'm saying. It's simply access to certain things facilitates the career a little bit differently than someone else. Some of the other things that set legends and masters apart is they do adhere to some long-standing traditions that might seem outdated. Well, Horiyoshi now lines people with tattoo machines. He does the shading and coloring by hand sometimes. This is a tradition that's outdated. It's been long gone for nearly a century. But he carries on some of these traditions, and it's a part of honoring the past of tattooing people. And of course, if there's really one thing that sets apart these legends and masters from other tattooers, they have a public following. And not just a public following of consumers who regard them as legends and masters, as well as tattoo insiders who regard them that way. And again, most people aren't going to be in that position. Most people are probably either craftsmen or artists. And they're skilled at what they do. They're amazing at what they do. Craftsmen have a little bit different reward system. They really value the traditional, established way of doing things in tattooing. That is, things were done a certain way in the past, and they really pride themselves on carrying on those traditions. So there's a certain way you're supposed to outline an image, and that all images that become tattoos should have some kind of outline on it. And it's not a really 100% rule, but probably 95 or 99% of the time, it's a pretty important rule for the craftsman to uphold. They also tend to have an interest in building some of the supplies for tattooing. That is, craftsmen get interested in learning the intricacies of not just producing tattoos, but building things like machines. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's actually got an engraving on it. It says Rollomatic. That goes back to a particular tattooer. And we're going to get into the roller banks in a little bit. But they value things like building machines. Now, in the bottom corner on that side, that actually comes from a set of machine builders, Workhorse Irons out in the Pacific Northwest. That you can buy this, but it's called the build-it-yourself machine. They'll send you the parts just like that in a little box, and then you have to figure out how to build it. But there's honor in being able to do that. If you can build your own tattoo machine, you know how to do something. And I remember a conversation with one tattooer one time. He said something to me, something to the effect of, not knowing how to build your own tattoo machine would be like driving a car and not knowing how to put air in it. Why are you driving? Like, not put air in the tires, you probably shouldn't be driving because that creates unsafe conditions. If you don't know how to build your tattoo machine, maybe you shouldn't be doing that to people. Now, there are certainly people that are in that category of not knowing how to do it, and that's okay. But that's part of the values that craftsmen hold in opposition to other people in this occupation. Some of these images, this is not as clear as I thought it was going to be. This is actually the line drawing of that tattoo. And it goes back to the cover of Tattooing A to Z, produced by Huck Spalding. I had mentioned Milton Zeiss's supply company. Huck Spalding and Paul Rogers had their own supply company out of the East Coast. That was another one of the major supply companies historically, and they produced this book, Tattooing A to Z. And recently, Chad turned this into a tattoo for a much older gentleman. And that hangs on the wall of the shop there. Yeah, we've covered that. Artists, they have their own hierarchy. They have their own sets of rewards, their own sets of values and beliefs, and they're not completely independent from the craftsman. Now, one of the reasons that there was overlap in that image I showed was that generally the artists aren't the ones doing the training of new tattooists. That is, when somebody's seeking an apprenticeship, they're generally seeking that from the craftsman. And this deals with part of the orientation to work. Artists are interested in producing art and earning artistic capital. They're not interested in taking the time to teach somebody the history of this craft or to teach them how things were done 50 years ago. They're interested in carving out their own artistic identity as the creator of some kind of aesthetic that's original, something that we haven't seen in tattooing yet. But some of those values, because they are apprenticed by craftsmen, bleed over into that artist hierarchy. Is that making sense? It's not always 100%, but some of that bleeds over into them. Additionally, artists aren't completely independent from these craftsmen. Generally, craftsmen are the ones that become interested in doing things like building machines or mixing pigments together to get inks. Well, if the artist is concerned with solely making new aesthetics, time to build machines or mix pigments is time out of them being creative artistically. So they rely on craftsmen in order to get some of those materials necessary to produce high-end artistic tattoos. One of the things that artists really value is being able to develop their own style that is them. And this means often violating some of those rules or some of those traditions that craftsmen hold so dearly. Now, in the upper corner here, we have this portrait tattoo of Bill Murray. It's a portrait tattoo, it looks great. When portrait tattoos started to become popular about 15 years ago or so, somewhere in that range, the craftsmen were not happy with this because it violated some of the rules that they held so deeply about how to tattoo. See, the craftsmen valued rules like drawing deep outlines with a lot of precision in them. But what you don't see on this portrait tattoo is a single outline. And the craftsmen argued, you're not supposed to do that because then the colors will bleed together over time. Then that tattoo won't look good in 10 or 15 years. You're supposed to stick to the ways we did it in the past. But it is a cool new aesthetic. It's definitely different from what those craftsmen had been holding so dearly for a while. And of course, this is from Amanda Wacob. She was in Richmond. She obviously had an art degree. That looks more like a Jackson Pollock painting than a tattoo. It's a very abstract art, watercolor kind of tattooing. That became popular about 10, 15 years ago as well. Sometime in the last year or two, we saw the emergence of these tattoos that look like patches on people's skin. That wave is currently in its enthusiasm. I don't know if it's at the peak, but it's definitely up there as far as the enthusiasm for it. And then there are other kinds of aesthetics of tattooing that ultimately become sort of accepted. And I think portrait work has become accepted. This has become accepted. This is still a question right now. And this is definitely accepted. That bottom corner is what they would call biomechanical, possibly bioorganic style tattooing. Comes from a tattooer named Guy Aitchison. A lot of that is actually influenced from the art world. In fact, his inspiration, he draws directly from the artist H.R. Geiger. If you're familiar with H.R. Geiger, it was these really dark paintings of aliens with pistons and things in them. And I shouldn't say paintings, they were actually drawings, I believe. Anyhow, that became legitimated as its own kind of aesthetic within tattooing. But it was with somebody pushing the boundaries of what's possible and not adhering to those traditions that the craftsmen valued so deeply. Of course, at the bottom of this hierarchy are the scratchers and the shopless. The scratchers are a necessary evil. They are. They're a kind of folk devil. and it's a sort of source of contention between tattooers that see themselves as legitimate and all those things that they see as illegitimate. Now, nobody admits to being this, so it's kind of a social type. It doesn't really exist, but it does exist. And it's a way for those working in shops to legitimate their own labor and say, we don't do that kind of work. Now, earlier I said every definition of a scratcher has some really, really bad connotation to it. It can be for all sorts of behavior. You're a poor artist. You're a poor craft person at even applying tattoos. You didn't shower before work. You're smoking in the back of the shop. You're rude to customers. You party too much. You've actually hurt people. You spread disease. The list can go on and on and on. It can be a very long list. But the point is, every way in which somebody talks about a scratcher is, that's a bad thing. We're not like that. So it becomes this sort of label that people don't want to get identified as, but it's important for policing the boundaries of legitimate tattooing. And I met some of these people. This photograph here was given to me by a tattooer who I actually interviewed. He was telling me about a scratcher that he knew who was working around a couple blocks from his shop. And it's a basketball here, it says Hoop Life. I won't use the words that this tattooer used, but let's just say he probably assumed that some violence should be taken towards this gentleman's hands for putting something like that on somebody's body. But it's easy to get into tattooing now. And I say that in the sense that I took that screenshot off of Walmart's webpage the other night. For $60, you can go get a tattoo kit. Now, I don't think a single tattooer that's been in the occupation a while would advise doing this, but you can go to Walmart and get a tattoo kit and just go to town on whoever you want. Now, remember a few slides ago I pointed out that Rollomatic machine? That's a handmade machine. That doesn't cost $60, and just the machine itself might run you several $100s just to possess it. Something like that's going to prevent somebody from getting all these materials. That includes needles, pigments, and you only get two gloves. That's it. So if you tattoo more than one person, you're in trouble. Heaven forbid you need to change your gloves in the middle of it. I wouldn't advise, again, this is actually a prison tattoo machine. I mean, it doesn't take much to make a tattoo machine. You just need something to push a needle into the skin a little bit. I'm trying to think of where I was that the scratcher thought. At least some of people are prevented by the cost of getting like legitimate tattoo equipment in their hands. Tattooers will probably tell you don't go to Walmart or Amazon and find that kind of stuff. And they say it's cheap, and the pigments are actually companies that tattooers have never really worked with or heard of, so there's a big question of what's actually in them. And it's getting put into people's bodies. But while I was in Baltimore, I did run into a couple people that were doing this kind of work. Some went from house to house tattooing others. Others had their own little mobile party going on. One guy had a van decked out with a little tattoo set up in the back of his van, and he would drive to people's driveways or park out front and tattoo them. The tattoo party thing was really interesting. The city of Baltimore has some serious hustlers, and basically this was a way for people to make money, and a tattoo party was an interesting kind of organization. The host of the party, they weren't a tattooer. They would find a tattooer who would show up to their house, and they would charge a sum at the door, usually like $5 or $10. So the host is getting money by people coming over to their house. And then some of the hosts were even more elaborate with their money. They would charge people for plates of food, $5 or $10. They'd charge them for drinks too. Then the people would also pay to get tattooed by this tattooer. And the tattooer shows up knowing that if they do a certain number of tattoos, they're going to walk away with several $100s. But they intentionally only do tattoos that are about a half hour long so they can continue to collect money from people. They're not doing elaborate tattoos or anything like that. And ultimately that stunts their careers because they can't do the kinds of artistic things that the craftsmen and artists really appreciate as tattoos. But it was some really interesting stuff. So, every tattooist has a kind of career. When we think of careers, it's the experience people have, the sort of sequence of movements they have through some kind of experience. And this is Mike Malone, Rollo Banks again, that Rollomatic machine made as a tribute to him. Mike Malone has an interesting statement here because he says, my grandpa took me to hang out in Skid Row where there were tattooers, so I saw it at a young age. And in talking to people during this study, every single one of them mentioned a similar thing, that early on in life, they developed an interest in art. And then at some point, they made a connection between their interest in art and that bodies could have art in them. They could have tattoos. Usually they had a loved one or relative that they saw at a young age. Maybe an uncle had a tattoo on a forearm, and they were able to make this connection. And then they made the connection that, wait, I can do that to people's bodies? And then they start thinking about, how do I do that to people's bodies? And there's something really interesting about these photographs here. That's actually a young Ed Hardy using colored pencil on his childhood friend. Within a couple decades, that young Ed Hardy would be in art school producing etchings like this. Pretty phenomenal stuff. But the point of this is, he had an interest in art early on in his life. He made the connection that you could put art on people's bodies, and then sought out a career where he could do this to others. That sort of precedes people entering the occupation, but then there's this sort of challenge of getting into the occupation. How most people I talk to, they first started off by experimenting. They got some tattoo equipment, probably not from Walmart back then, maybe Craigslist or something like that. They got some tattoo equipment, maybe eBay. So they got this equipment, they called up a friend or a family member or something, and they tattooed them, and every single one had a similar sort of reaction. That was not what I wanted to do to them. They realized very quickly that in trying this out, what they thought they could do in their head did not match the physical skill sets of their bodies, and that they needed to seek somebody out who knew about this. That is, somebody who could teach them how to do this. And tattooing is actually a fairly complex form of art. The way a tattooer recently described it to me, he's actually a wonderful sociologist. His name is Dustin Kiskaden. He's also a tattooer, was that all of the motions for tattooing come from the sort of shoulders and body, that you're not ever using your wrist or bending your joints here, that you're actually drawing across things. So it's a very physically demanding kind of labor versus just writing with our wrists or something like that. And these are the kinds of things that you need to learn from somebody who knows how to do it. But what many find out very quickly is, even if they went to art school or something like that, it's hard to find mentors. I mean, there's an oversupply of people who want to be tattooers, and there's definitely an undersupply of people who want to teach you. After all, if somebody teaches you what their livelihood is, you are now a threat to their livelihood, and there's no sort of guarantee that they won't open up a shop down the street and take some of your business away. One of the sort of conundrums here then is, you've got all these people that want to learn, and then they ask others if they'll teach them, but they're often asking tattooers who don't really know that person. And so they're told to get out of their shops, not so nicely, but usually very rudely. And this gives those that are willing to take on apprentices the opportunity to select people. And they take a lot of time to select people. Often, when they select people, it's not based off of the quality of their art or some sort of formal credential of having an art degree or something like that. It's because they already have a shared relationship that they've established with this person. Typically, they are a client or something like that with the tattooer who's going to take on the apprentice. And that tattooer views the potential apprentice as somebody who's got certain characteristics. Maybe they see him as someone who cares about tattooing. Maybe they think they're actually trustworthy and won't in a few years open up a shop down the street. Maybe they see the way they talk to others in the shop and they think that that's the kind of personality I'd like to have working here. So it's not necessarily that they pick people based off of their sort of art experiences or something like that. Rather, mentors or prospective mentors are able to select people on their personal characteristics, and they really can pick who they want, and it's not necessarily the best artist. It's the person that they think is going to be the best fit for them, and that's going to carry on the sort of traditions for tattooing. Obviously, I mentioned that line drawing that we couldn't see that was also a tattoo. This is Huck Spalding's Tattooing A to Z. That same drawing is on the cover of the book. For years, that was one of the only books published about learning how to tattoo. Things have changed in the last 10 years rapidly. YouTube and whatnot has really changed how tattooers learn about things. Anyhow, some would struggle to learn how to tattoo. Because there are so many people willing to apprentice, often the apprenticeship becomes a form of exploited labor. People are given all sorts of hard tasks to do. Some apprenticeships are pretty demeaning and rude. Some are sexually exploitive. And this happens quite routinely in the tattoo world. Unfortunately, it happens more than it should, but it's not like that's the only characteristic here. The way this process is viewed is that the prospective apprentice is learning something that's going to pay for their entire livelihood. And by not getting paid and learning this craft for several months or a year or two, you're learning what ultimately will become your future. And someone who isn't dedicated to the craft will quit their apprenticeship, versus someone who's dedicated will stick it out and ultimately become a tattooer. One of the things, though, I covered that. Yeah, it's gatekeeping, right? Weeding people out, keeping them out of the occupation. Yeah, apprenticeships are meant to be gatekeeping things. If somebody doesn't get an apprenticeship, sometimes they continue to experiment. Sometimes their career ends on the spot there. Right? They figure nobody's willing to hire me to tattoo. I've got to find a new job. But some keep doing this to others, and they don't know what they're doing. In fact, I ran into one gentleman. He's probably what we would categorize in the scratcher category. Tattooing wasn't a full-time thing for him. He had another job in sort of the construction industry. It was part-time, so he tattooed part-time. For months, he was tattooing people, and they would come back to him a couple weeks later and say, all the color fell out of my tattoo. That's because he was doing the outline appropriately, but he didn't know how to hold the machine to get the color to stay in the skin. And so for months, he's doing this, and people are coming back going, something's wrong. But it's the kind of thing where if you were in a tattoo shop and you had an experienced mentor, they go, hey, you need to hold the machine this way and use this technique to get that to produce that effect. He had to continue to experiment on his own, meaning he had to do this to a lot of bodies before he figured out a technique that would actually work for him. There are different methods of training. These come with different levels of prestige. Obviously, at the highest of this is the formal apprenticeship. These are exceedingly rare. This is the kind of training that, say, Horiyoshi III had. I think I've only ever met one or two people in my life that's had this sort of formal apprenticeship. This is the kind of training that lasts for 3 or 5 years, maybe even longer. Sometimes people don't even touch a tattoo machine until a couple years into that training. And that's a long apprenticeship, and there are times where it's accompanied by contracts that you will work for this number of years or this number of months under me, something like that. These are long kinds of things, but it's a very paternalistic way to pass on the craft, and like Horiyoshi, you're kind of passing on the honor, that tradition of that to a new generation who's going to then carry that history forward. What most people undergo are casual apprenticeships. These are far more abbreviated, generally 6 months-ish, 12 months-ish, sometimes as short as 2, sometimes a little shorter depending on the needs of staffing at a tattoo shop and the interest of who's doing the mentorship. These are far less formal, less paternalistic in that the expectation is the mentor is handing something down to the apprentice. Instead, in the casual apprenticeship, the onus of the burden is on the apprentice, who's supposed to show up and ask questions. Try and figure this out by observing others or going to other events, say at tattoo convention, and watching somebody tattoo and trying to figure it out on their own. So there's a little bit more independence, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, because to some degree it encourages the casual apprentice, especially the inquisitive one, to be a bit critical of how do I learn and grow, and to do that independent of a mentor who's sort of passing it down to them. In fact, one of the things about casual apprentice, why some of them are brief sometimes shop owners do this, and they need a new worker. And after a month or two, somebody that probably had a very abbreviated apprenticeship is tattooing, and I've met a couple of these tattooers, I've interviewed a couple in the book. They were like, yeah, I probably should have been tattooing then, but the owner wanted more money, because the way tattooing works is you pay for a tattoo, and typically early in your career, half of that money gets forked over to the owner. So it's in the owner's interest to some degree to train some apprentices very quickly, because they become a financial asset. One guy told me that it was something like 3 or 4 weeks, and as soon as he could assemble a tattoo machine on his own, the owner let him loose on people, and he had no idea what he was doing. He's like, I could do a basic tattoo, and I look at it now, and it is not what I think tattooing is. But it took him years to sort of grow on his own after that experience. There are some other ways to learn. One is tattoo school. Generally, tattoo schools are regarded as a financial scam. They're used to sort of fleece those who want an apprenticeship out of money. People who are offering tattoo schools often charge $5,000 or more, and supposedly in 2 weeks somebody has enough skills to go out and get a job and tattoo on their own. Keep in mind, we've got people that are doing these formal apprenticeships and casual apprenticeships for no money for sometimes a year, 5 years, and yet in 2 weeks someone who can pay for this can be a tattooer. Now, why I think they're really a sort of bad thing for tattooers, I don't mean bad in behavior, but why tattooers define it as problematic. It has less to do with the actual teachings of it, and more to do with that respect for honor and tradition. See, in the apprenticeship model, somebody has to pay their dues to earn the title of tattooist. But when somebody goes to a tattoo school, they pay money for the title. And that is, forking out money for the title is far different than having this experience of somebody pressuring you to learn and not getting paid for it. And then finally, there's the sort of self-taught. I've only known a few people that were successful self-taught. One is actually incredibly successful, but their career trajectories began in the 80s. A little bit different than people that began in the 90s or 2000s. They were beginning with different sort of constraints under how they produced tattoos. So, once we want to be a tattooer, we got to find tools. Of course, we can make tools, like that pencil up there. In fact, we know for a fact somebody is doing stick and poke hand tattoos out of the dorms at ISU. We've seen them because their clients have walked into the tattoo shops in town here, and we know this happens. So you can do that to people. That's one way to make tools. You can make your own. You can also get these kind of tattoo kits. This isn't from Amazon. This is a screenshot from, this isn't from Walmart. This is a screenshot from Amazon. $60, pretty similar to the other one. Tattooers will laugh if you show up with this kind of equipment in their shop. Definitely not regarded as quality stuff. But how do we get equipment? And one of the things that tattooers have been very successful at, despite not having strong professional associations or ties to the state, is keeping people out of tattooing by limiting access to things like the tools and materials needed to tattoo. A high-quality tattoo machine, you might have to go to somebody who's been in tattooing for 20 or 30 years, who spent an entire career figuring out how to build good machines. And they might also be a pretty good tattooer. Well, if they don't know who your mentor was, and they don't know or they can't verify that you work in a legitimate shop, they're not going to sell you stuff. In fact, there are online websites of tattoo distributors that on their websites will legitimately say, if we can't figure out that you were an actual tattooer in a shop, we will not send you anything. We will cancel your order, and we will keep your money as a tax for you wasting our time. There's even one website that actually has a password on it, and you can't peruse their materials unless you have the password. So tattooers have been quite successful. And I think the one with the password is actually a magazine that's internal to tattooing. It's not like the magazines we get on the stand. It actually has information about how to tattoo in it. It's more like an industry magazine rather than a magazine telling you about the people or the tattoos that people have on their bodies. So it becomes challenging to even find equipment, and this is part of the importance of that apprenticeship process. You're going to make those connections, and your mentor is going to vouch for you when you go to a shop. There's one tattooer said it to me. He said, legitimate distributors if you go to buy from them for the first time, they will call up your mentor and say, hey, does Ding Dong work for you? And if they say yes, you're good. If they say no, you're not buying stuff from them. And obviously there's this custom materials, this is a custom machine. Access is the issue, and finding established sources comes from connections with mentors. These networks are there, it's just a matter of massaging them, and not all tattooists start in the same place with these networks. So there is a lot of occupational mobility in tattooing. There's a lot of horizontal mobility. Tattooing is a great occupation to pack up and travel, and there's a long history of traveling tattooing in the United States, long history of carnival tattooers. In fact, Illinois State actually has a collection of carnival tattooers in their archives, in the circus archives. There's a long history of this going on in the United States, and it continues to this day. People also travel globally with this. I mean, when you think about it, you really only need a handful of machines, some pigments, and some needles, and you're good to go. So for some people, and as one of my interviewees worded it, it's my passport. He gets to travel wherever he wants in the world, charge people for this service that's in high demand, and then he can pack up in a couple weeks and go someplace else. Then eventually he might settle down somewhere for a year or two, and then he'll pack up and go somewhere else. Really, the only sort of vertical mobility then is apprentice, tattooer, or shop owner. And that's within a shop. That's about it. But I think it's important to point out, because shop owners are small business owners. And not just small business owners, they're small business owners of art communities. And these are localized art communities. There's over 10,000 tattoo shops in the United States right now. There's only 13,000 McDonald's. There is not a single tattoo shop that's a franchise. Every single tattoo shop is a small business, and if owners have more than one, they might have two, maybe three, but it's not like they're setting up franchises and there's a Starbucks on the corner next week. These are the small business owners that help make up art communities. There's a reason why I spoke to Chad about doing this. Right? This is part of our art community here in Bloomington, and it's a vital part of having thriving art communities. So for time's sake, we're gonna skip a little here. Yeah, we're going to skip a little. We're going to do this real quick. All right, there are some sources of contention in tattooing. One of them is between the artist and craftsman. Artist and craftsman, I've got a portrait here of Jack Nicholson in The Shining, and then a sort of old school Sailor Jerry Eagle tattoo here. Craftsmen argued that this wouldn't hold up over time, because they valued these sorts of outlines on tattoos, followed by the shading inside of it, that there was a time-tested way of doing this. In fact, as one tattooer told me, that portrait tattoo isn't going to look good on a roofer's back in 30 years, but that Sailor Jerry tattoo will be there, and I can tell you that. In essence, the contention is around what you should and shouldn't be doing, how you should be applying these tattoos. Adding to this, it's not like there's an open hostility, right? They might sort of say that's not how you're supposed to tattoo. They're also dependent upon one another. New aesthetics don't get generated in tattooing without those artists who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Right? We have that sort of biomechanical or bioorganic style. That was somebody who was incorporating aesthetics that tattooers weren't working on, but then they incorporated it and it became legitimated as its own kind of genre of tattooing. And now it's part of the sort of staple of styles people can ask for when they go into tattoo shops. Obviously, there's a conflict between scratchers and tattooists. These are sort of the memes I pull offline. You know, this is the untrained versus the trained, and you know, spreading diseases and things and whatnot. You know, the scratchers are bad news kind of stuff. But we're gonna skip ahead. You know, I had some interesting things to say here. In all of these magazines, though, we can tell how they're selling them. This is Tattoos for Men, which features a woman on the cover. It's fairly clear how they're selling this to audiences. The magazine industry really sort of exploited this trend, and many of those magazines aren't published internally by tattooers. They're published by people who are in the magazine business. They want to make money off magazines, and this is a hip trend for them to sell styles and things to people. And so there's been the proliferation of this over the last 20 years or so. Part of that is tied to the sort of explosion of tattoo shows. Tattoo shows, these are really constructed narratives. Reality TV It's a familiar formula. All reality TV focuses on the dramatic narratives. It doesn't really focus on what tattooers do, so everyone I've interviewed complains about reality TV. But there's an important part about it, though. Even though they complain about it making their relationships with customers a little bit more difficult, reality TV brought tattooing into people's living rooms, and it's done so for almost 20 years now. And it gave people more access to it than ever before. People that potentially might not have walked into tattoo shops 10 or 15 years ago could watch reality TV and see that maybe it's not as threatening as those stereotypes I saw. So I want to end with a little story here, and it's a story that was told to me by somebody I interviewed. He goes by the pseudonym Edgar in the book. Really sort of old school craftsman kind of person that made pigments. He was really proud of the fact that he made different inks and he would travel around selling them to people. Now, this photo is obviously from right over there. That's Sailor Jerry's grave. The story that was told to me was an afternoon, and it was between tattoos. Edgar sat down with me and he looked at me and said, "Dave, you got to hear about this guy." His name was Mike Malone, went by Rollo Banks. He said, "I worked with him up in Minneapolis at his shop up there. And he was just this old guy, super nice, would sit there, and it was the kind of shop where people would come in and pick tattoos off the wall, nothing super artistic, just flash designs, and he'd put them on them and he'd send them on their way, and every person he tattooed, he would say, 'Be good to your tattoo and it will be good to you.' And when you think about it, it doesn't really mean a lot. But as a narrative, as a story, it kind of does. Doesn't that say something about his value for tattooing and carrying on this sort of history? If you be good to tattooing, it'll also be good to you. And then he keeps going on in the story. He says, when Sailor Jerry died, he left a letter to his wife. And in this letter, he instructed his wife to burn his tattoo shop to the ground if he should ever die. And at some point, we stop the conversation, and Edgar has to tell me about how important it is, and I have to know this information. Now, yes, he instructed her to burn it down, but there were 3 ifs in it. One was if you could sell it, and he had a list of people that you could sell the shop to. One was Ed Hardy. He said, the first person on the list is Ed Hardy, and if Ed Hardy doesn't want it, well, go to the next person. Well, Ed Hardy at the time period was in Japan, supposedly. He was working with Japanese tattoo masters there, fulfilling his lifelong dream of tattooing in Japan and learning these secret ancient parts of the craft. So he wasn't buying the shop. He wasn't interested. The next person on the list was Zeke Owen. Zeke Owen was actually Ed Hardy's second mentor. Zeke Owen had just had a stint as a traveling tattooer. He had opened up a shop in San Diego. Why would he go to Hawaii? I mean, in San Diego, he's got access to a military base, all sorts of people that want to be tattooed. And he had just done the traveling thing. He was settled, done. Third person on the list was Mike Malone. Mike Malone bought the shop, didn't get burned down, so I guess there's a happy part to the story. But as a narrative and a kind of story, it's really about protecting this history. And it's a value that tattooists hold so deeply. And to some degree, isn't it about the fact that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants embedded in these networks and communities necessary to produce and distribute culture? I mean, the story is telling me that all of Sailor Jerry's legacy was going to be burnt to the ground. And now that's a name that gets tossed around in popular culture circles as this important person in tattoo history in America. But that's not where the story ends. This is, you see, Chad at Illinois Tattoo Company, he worked with Mike Malone for a while. That's why there's this collection of sort of Rollo Banks things in his sort of private collection. That living history is right here in this community. That's my story. That's the story, and thank you. I guess we have time for questions now.
That was fascinating. Does anybody have any questions for Dave?
Want me to?
Yes, and what I'm going to do is you're going to say the question and then I'll repeat it so our people online can hear it.
I actually have 3 questions. Does the art of
Yes, far enough that the oldest human remains we've ever recovered have tattoos on them. I'll say the Iceman, 5,000-year-old body has tattoos. Mummies from Peru from a couple thousand years ago have tattoos. Recently, Aaron Dieterwolf, he's an archaeologist. He's found 2,000-year-old tattoo needles in Tennessee, as well as over 1,000-year-old tattoo needles in the Southwest in the United States. So we know it's a thousands-year-old practice. It might be one of the oldest body practices, and yet it has this strange history of not really shining, if that makes sense. Like, we've known it's been around, but we haven't known it's been around.
Yes, yes.
Are there some people that are allergic to the ink or the pigments that you use, and that's discovered early in the process?
Are there people that are allergic to the pigment used, and how early in the process is that discovered?
There are some old stories about this, that for a long time, apparently, red pigments were derived from shellfish. At least some of the reds were. Keep in mind, up until about the mid-1960s, there were only 6 to 8 colors of pigment available. The color palette in the last sort of 30 years has exploded with tattoo pigments. Prior to that, there really weren't that many colors. It wasn't until, I can't remember when, purple didn't exist until like the 1960s or 1970s as a pigment, because it wouldn't stay in skin very long. There are certain colors that definitely don't stay in skin long now, but to answer your basic question, yes, for a while there were some pigments that people actually had allergic reactions to because there was no other way to derive that color. Or at least they hadn't figured it out, and what you'd find out when you'd have a reaction to a red pigment in your tattoo, but that hasn't gone on for decades.
Is that your last one? Okay, one more.
Have you yourself done any tattooing to someone?
Have you done any tattooing on anyone?
No, and you don't want me to. I'm a horrible artist. I just get the tattoos and hang out with people who do them.
Excellent. Any other question? Yes?
Not so much a question, but just an observation. There's a whole other side that this was wonderful, but the impact and the culture of the people getting them, and when you talk about historically, throughout history, they're like only the rich and famous, the hierarchy of people up here would get them, but then you go through, the horrors of Nazis tattooing people. So sometimes, and I'm a hairstylist, and I was a salon full of people with tattoos, and when older people come in, they'll say to me, they are so going to regret those tattoos, and I always tell them, no, they're not, because their generation doesn't judge them for their tattoos. Their generation accepts it as art. My generation, they were those people with tattoos. So there's a difference, even in my lifetime, of how they're accepted.
And you're absolutely right. And there's a long history of wealthy people getting tattooed. Ancient Egypt, it was reserved for priestesses, for fertility. But there's something important you said about World War II, in that wasn't an artistic tattoo, right? They were using those tattoos for bureaucratic record keeping and control over bodies. And I think, when we get to this sort of, how does tattooing become deviant and stigmatized, part of it is a reaction to that Nazis were actually using stamps of numbers on people's bodies. And that's far different than some of the imagery that we saw here today.
And then a whole other part of my world is for 25 years I did cosmetic tattooing for many medical applications, reconstructive breasts, alopecia, vitiligo. And what I learned so much about the tattoo world and the tattooists, and they're wonderful people. Most of them have very high standards, which you've spoken about, of their industry and their ethical.
They want to work hard and carve out a living and be appreciated like everybody else in this world. And I don't mean to cut you off, but that's what I find too. Like, they're hardworking individuals, and they are our society.
And what I did with cosmetic tattooing, there was a huge crossover. We learned so much from the tattoo. I've not done it for 5 years now, so 30 years ago I started doing it.
And the cosmetic tattooing, that's just an extension of tattooing, not necessarily in the artistic side, but it's using the same process of inserting pigments into skin to create a kind of effect on a body. So that it's not too far off.
And to her question about the pigments, they are not FDA approved. There's
No.
not an FDA approved pigment on the market
They aren't, and the crazy part is the FDA has said we ought to regulate some of this stuff, but we don't have the resources to do so. So it's really up to the person who's making the pigments to be on their game. And there have been a few minor disease outbreaks with tattoo pigments, but this is a once every 5 to 10 years, and we're talking 10 people get it kind of thing, not hepatitis spreading across New York City or something like that.
Wow. Any other questions? Got time? One more, yes.
Is there a hierarchy or are there skilled prison tattooists?
Are there skilled prison tattooists and a hierarchy there?
I don't think I've ever seen a good tattoo that was made in prison.
You know, this is a long conversation. But there are certain people that develop their own aesthetics in prison that became a kind of outsider art that then became a legitimated genre in tattooing. And I'm thinking of Freddie Negretti in the East LA sort of tattoo scene. He was doing these sort of monochrome things that only had a single needle, whereas, you know, tattoo's gonna have groupings of needles that are pushing it in. In prison, he was doing it with like a guitar string or whatever he could find as a needle, and he would have these really fine line images, but it was legitimated because other tattooers of high status appreciated the tattoos he was doing, and then they accepted him into the sort of legitimate tattoo world. Not for most, and that's where somewhere there had to be access or networks to that opportunity to just move from prison to that tattoo world. I mean, there's an interesting program in Minneapolis, or in Minnesota right now, though. They're starting a tattoo school in one of the prisons in Minnesota. Hopefully, so people can get jobs when they leave as tattooers.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for the fantastic questions, and thank you, David, for an excellent program. And thanks to all of you who tuned in at home as well, and enjoy the rest of this lovely evening outside. Come back and see us soon. Thank you.